Hello, and welcome to episode 30 of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. So, this is the first of the weekly episodes, and I'm really excited about today's episode. I couldn't quite believe it when this interview came through. It is with, you probably already know because you've clicked on the episode, it's with Jack Casady. Absolutely legendary bass player from Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna, and he's done loads of other stuff. Played with Jimi Hendrix and played Woodstock Festival, and oh my goodness, I just can't believe how much cool stuff he's done. And he's such a nice chap as well. He's really intelligent, super funny, and he talks us through all of his bass rig. He talks us through recording at RCA in Hollywood, and then onto Wally Hyder Studios. Talks about growing up and playing in the club scene in Washington as a guitarist, and his musical tastes as a sort of a young man through his teens, and how that went on to influence how he wrote with Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna. Just a really interesting interview, and he was such a great guy. So I really hope you enjoy this. I'd also thought I'd introduce every episode now because I send off stems every Tuesday, these isolated drum stems. So I thought I'd tell you what the stems are each week. Seeing as they go out on the same day, I may as well start tying all this together. So the stems this Tuesday are going to be I'm Only Sleeping from Revolver, which I know is not necessarily known for its drum parts, but that's I'm going to get through all of them. And what am I now? This is number 48, I think I've done of these. And it's just a really nice chilled out drum groove, to be honest. And it's one, if you're using these stems for writing or sampling at all, this is one that definitely will work for that. So I hope you enjoy that. And that's that. So I will just drop straight into the episode. There is not really a formal introduction because we chatted for quite a while before I started recording. So it sort of just works its way straight in. And then there was a few interruptions as we went through the conversation, just because it was quite a relaxed conversation. So I've edited them out. But if the audio jumps around, it shouldn't jump around noticeably. But if the conversation sort of moves a little bit, you'll know that's why I've cut out a big period of a pause. There's one particular bit, maybe 2/3 of the way through this episode, where Jack finds a photo for me on his phone, and it takes it about 10 minutes to find the picture. And it was worth it because it was a really cool picture. So I've edited out the time when he was looking for the picture, but then suddenly the audio says, okay, so here we go. And I go, oh, wow. And that's when he shows me the picture. So anyway, you'll get the idea. Hope you enjoy this episode. Here we go. It's Jack Casady. First of all, I just want to say, I know we've been chatting for 15 minutes already, but I just want to say thank you for taking the time to speak to me. I do really appreciate it.
Well, this is fun. This is great. And all I can say, I'm just thankful that all the equipment's working right now. Anytime the picture pops up, you say, and there's the sound, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Glory be.
Fortunately, I haven't had any recording sort of mishaps yet, but
well, it's computers. Anything can happen. Yeah. Not to mention Wi-Fi and all of that.
I just wanted to start by asking about Al Schmidt, which I know is a bit of a downer to begin on. Obviously, right. we lost him this week.
Well, actually, it really is the opposite. I just posted a picture, Al and I, when we with the Jefferson Airplane received a Grammy in 2016 for a Lifetime Achievement. And so I was able to go to that, and I saw Al, and of course Al and I are old friends, and as you know, he worked with us on many Jefferson Airplane Hot Tuna albums. And Al and I, we had reconnected through Facebook a bunch, but after we got a chance to talk and hang out a little bit here in Los Angeles, then we really kept up much more of a contact than we had in years. But of course, Al is such a huge influence in making musicians comfortable in the studio. You never thought that he was on the other side, or he was so aware and in tune of what you were trying to get in the studio, and offered the kind of advice and information that allowed you to get that in the studio. Because a lot of times in that early recording days, the only time you got in the studio was to make an album that was put out, and then you went out on the road. So the studio's become accessible to everybody, from recording on your iPhone now to being able to buy high quality equipment for a reasonable amount of money, and make good quality recordings. But when I started recording with a record company, RCA, and Al Schmidt was involved, the only way you got into that high-end machinery, which was all tube driven, and to get your access to all of that equipment was to get a record contract, so you had access to it all. So it was a different world then. Although my father, being an audiophile, he was a dentist and came from a doctor family. I come from a physician and dentist family. He was an audiophile in the 50s, early 50s, and I had access to recording tape recorders and whatnot. And I carried around a Wallensack tape recorder and made a lot of recordings early on. I was familiar with it, but of course, being in a real studio at that time, what was called a real studio, you had access to the top of the line equipment and worked in that environment. And Al was just, I think I learned more about Al in the last 5 years than I had ever known him before. And we had a lot of contact over Facebook, and his humanness and his desire to do good in the world. He's just a kind, gentle human being. The kinds of things he would post, and taking care of animals and seeing flowers and looking at nature and being in awe of all the beautiful things the world has to offer. That was Al. And of course, all the artists he worked with, I'm sure they all say what a gentleman he was to work with, and what an inspiration. Because there's so many times when you work, you're a young artist. If you're with a record company, a lot of times they'll take a producer and put you in with a producer, and there can be friction. You're trying to get at something that you've done maybe in person, and you got a certain sound. You get into the studio trying to capture that. But Al teaches you that the studio is another world altogether, and that if you shake hands with that world and get into that world, you're going to find some things that you hadn't discovered before that will only enhance your musical direction, and the attempt to implement that, to get what you have in your mind and your thought and your heart out there and hear it back, and you say, yeah, that's it, that's where I was headed.
While we're on this topic, it's obviously the Jefferson Airplane albums they had a particular sound to them, and it strikes me as not necessarily just a group going in and recording songs, sort of rabbit in the headlights style.
Well, that's how the first album was. But the first album with Signe Tolley, that was our lady singer. We basically recorded that on a 3-track. We had 2 tracks to record and 1 to bounce, and we went in there as a band and recorded in 4 days. Basically, wow. We played what we played at shows. Mm-hmm. The second album, after Grace had joined us, the following year in the first album in 1966, 67, we went into the studio, and that was the first one where we used the studio and created a sound and environment in the studio itself, where we had songs that were prepared but not fully arranged. We had songs, bits and pieces of some songs, and we finished them and arranged them in the studio, and that was really the beginning of working in the studio and being okay with that, uh, and finding a sound that then it was kind of the opposite. Then we went out to perform those songs and create that sound on stage, where before it had been all about creating the sound that was on stage in the studio.
That's interesting. It's almost an approach that people take now. That's what bands do now. They create something in the studio and then struggle to recreate it live.
Yeah. Now, of course, that's a double-edged sword. I mean, sometimes you work in your bedroom whispering your songs in like this, and all of a sudden you're in front of uh, uh, a mass of people, and you haven't learned how to project. I mean, the singers like Aretha Franklin worked for years before you got worked projecting her voice. Singers that that worked for long times in a club scene was usually how it worked, and then you finally got an opportunity to record. Had put a lot of miles on learning how to project their voice and whatnot. So uh, there's uh, there's all of that going on at the same time too.
Well, you kind of had the best of both worlds. That it was, you had all the live experience and then got to create in the studio, but also were experienced enough to then understand how to project that in, to use a different project in a different context, but how to then transfer that to live. Um,
Right.
so we're talking about RCA in Hollywood. That's correct? The
That's
studio.
right. Right down the street from where I am. Sunset and Ivor was the RCA building. Around the corner was the Capitol building, the big round one, and we lived up in San Francisco there. So we'd rent a house down here or something like that, for a period of time, and fly down from San Francisco.
How in the when you were treating the studio as more of an instrument, how did you do you remember much about how the day to day of those sessions went? What was the
Yeah,
general
pretty,
structure?
yeah, pretty much. Well, the structure is you'd work on your material with the different producers there, but as as we as we gained some traction with Surrealistic Pillar that had White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, our our contract came up for renegotiation, and we were able to then get really almost full control in the studio after that. And that was a big move. And a lot of bands were starting to do that then, and it had not been done before. A group of people, usually so many the lead singers or whatever would use the pro studio guys to cut the records, and then a band was put together, and you went out on the road and reproduced that. Here you had a band, for better or worse, everybody was going to play their own instrument. Nobody was going to fill in for them. So um, you had bands across both in England and here that were starting to come up and be recorded as full bands as they were. And of course, the Who, the Rolling Stones, and Jimi Hendrix coming from the kind of reinventing himself in England and coming back over. But you had bands that were starting to get control in the studio. And once you had a record and you got some traction on that record, and it came time to renegotiate, everybody, it was, why shouldn't we be in control of this? I don't want to be this. I don't want to sound like this producer who's done 20 different vocalists in a row with his sound. I want to develop my own sound. And you may not even know what that is, a concept, but from playing with your bandmates that there are moments where you gel and you have this sound. You want to capture that sound. That's unique of those people coming together. So that's what we were after.
And did you enter the studio with sort of songs that you'd loosely pieced together, or were you writing
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean,
studio?
after we had more time. I mean, the earlier first two albums, the clock was ticking. The
Yeah.
paying for it. And when we negotiate, we did after bidding at Baxter's. Maybe to our folly, we then spent. We were on tour and recording, so that's usually what happened. You had to keep your rent paid. You know, you had to go out and play. So that third album, I think like you said, the first album was 4 days. The second album was maybe 2 weeks. Surrealistic Pillow. I think the third album was over 2 months, but not all of that was in the studio. But we were able to have things like a lockout on the studio, 24-hour time session setup, so that we could work 1 or 2 weeks at a time, uh, uh, and enjoy the full environment of the studio.
Were you
I got a
requesting?
chance to create. The idea was to create in that studio, feel comfortable in there, and to write songs and put them together in the studio.
Okay, with no time pressure.
Exactly.
And how?
Somewhat.
Well, yeah, obviously.
Later on, you know, we spent that much in the studio. Oh my god.
So were you recording as you go? Was there was there a tape op sat in the control room recording jams, or how was the writing process
Well,
working?
we didn't. I mean, we went in there with songs. We were a song-oriented band. We had three singers in the band, four singers in the band. With everybody had their four different writers, and we came in, to work on the songs, and the bits and pieces of the songs. Out of that, a couple of jams happened, that got left on the album, and you do some experimental stuff, but we went in there to make songs. Now what was happening is they weren't in the format of a 3-minute song, not necessarily with a catchy little hook etc. So Marty had his approach to his songs, and Grace had her approach, and Paul Cantor, and of course you are. And I as a bass player that didn't play just rhythm on the bass. I enjoyed the different approaches uh, that I could test my my avenues of experimentation with. And so I always liked a lot of movement to the bass lines, and I like to move up and down the neck and experiment with working off the vocal melodies, but still trying to keep a hook in there and trying to keep the low end drive going all the time. So I really enjoyed that period of time with recording.
Was there a conversation within the band about the bass's role, uh, or
Nobody ever told anybody else what to play. There wasn't you play this hook or you play this repetitive lick or you play this. It really wasn't that way. Everybody gelled to try to work together to make it happen, but everybody was responsible for their own music. So um, that's what was unique about our band, and all the other bands in San Francisco too, with the Grateful Dead and the Quicksilver Messenger Service, all those early bands out of San Francisco. Uh, they were. It was a lot less rigid in the formats of the songs. There weren't a lot of top 40 hits out of all of that, but at the same time, this was the beginning of all night FM radio that would play a long cut. You know, I was fortunate to play a blues voodoo job with Jimi Hendrix, a 15-minute cut, and Mitch Mitchell became a good buddy of mine, and so did Jimmy, and when that happened, that cut was played not on AM top 40 format radio, but it was played at night from midnight to 6 in the morning with DJs that played like you would play jazz stations. They would play long cuts of the what was then the new music, and so you. As you wrote your music, you had a place for that music to be played, but at the end of the day, playing in person and playing in front of people was always where the rubber met the road.
how much so I'm still sort of thinking about the studio side of things. How much uh, control did you take over? I mean, let's say bass sound particularly, because you've got a very
Well,
distinctive sound.
yes, I did take control of my sound. Everybody took control. I mean, you had a sound you were developing. And don't forget, as young musicians, every time you came back in the studio, which was usually about once a year, you discovered new stuff in person playing. You know, you'd experimented with sound and all of that, and you came in and worked with the sound. So yeah, absolutely. I took control of the sound in the studio, and we everybody worked with their own sound and trying to get it. At the same time, there was lots I learned from Al Schmidt, the Versatone amplifier. This little, let's see if I can see those amplifiers right
Oh
there.
yes, yeah.
Those amplifiers, I discovered the Versatone. Bob Hall made those Versatones at Burbank, and they were basically a 35-watt hi-fi amplifier, and he made it for his wife who played stand-up bass as some sound reinforcement, uh, uh, and he developed that amplifier in a really unique style with a dual amplifier section, two tubes on one for the low end, two tubes for the high end, all going mono through a speaker, and it just has a golden tone on it. And when we were using stuff that in the studio that the engineers thought was just too loud for that format, it didn't record well. We liked a lot of times what we found out was it was too loud for the microphones there. In the bass end, I'd use larger cone speakers, 15-inch speakers and whatnot, but one of the second engineers took me into the studio next door where Carol Kay was recording, and later on we became pretty good friends with Carol. But in any case, she was using this Versatone, and she plays a whole different style than I do. Plays with a pick, whatnot. But the amplifier, the microphone loved that amplifier, and a low volume about 10 o'clock. It just for me, I started using a semi-hollow body Guild bass guitar that I rebuilt the electronics with Owsley Stanley,
Hmm.
the first one, and that's the one you see at Woodstock that I'm using. It's got a bunch of carvings all over it and everything, and to enhance the fidelity of that. But when I put that guitar, bass guitar, through that little Versatone amp, I just got the sweetest sound in the world. So I went out to Burbank and I asked, and I went to his shop, and he was making these amplifiers in the garage. And it's just fantastic. So anyway, there's a great story with this. I fell in love with the amplifier because I found out that when I bought one, I brought it in the studio, and you talk about experimenting in the studio, and I'd work with it off and on, and maybe I'll go into one of the unused studio rooms and play around with it. And what I found out was that with an acoustic, semi-hollow body acoustic instrument, bass guitar, when I cranked that amplifier up, it started to growl really nicely. And a lot of amplifiers on the bass end, it'll kind of get a buzz sound when you overdrive it, but it isn't necessarily a pleasant sound. This amplifier just brought out all the overtones, 1, 3, 5, 7, right in a row, really nice and crystal clear. When I cranked that up to about 11 or 12, I could sustain with it, but it was a really nice sustained sound. You'll hear that sound on Crown of Creation. You'll hear that sound start to come into my playing. And what we did, we put it on a chair, and there's some pictures of this you can find on
Really?
Facebook. It shows you. Just look for Jack Casady in the studio with a Versatone or something. There's a couple out there that shows me in the studio with a Versatone on a chair. And I would just use a Y-chord. One half would go into the Versatone, another half would go into my regular rig, which had, 215s in it. But I could, in the studio, I started taking that and putting it on a second track. Now, along with this, was the development of more tracks available in the studio. that allowed for more overdubbing, but more multi-tracking and isolating different instruments, but also different sounds to one instrument. So I would have one track for the basic bass sound. It was mic. I go through a preamp, a tube preamp, a nice warm tube preamp in the studio itself, so they would have a direct preamp sound. And then another track was used later on for that versatone sound, where I could crank that up, and maybe we put baffles around it so it wouldn't leak into something else. But I could crank that up and get that drive going along with that low end, and then I could mix the balance of sounds together with that. And today, of course, there's many more, much more ability to do that. But when we did the Surrealistic Pillow album in 1967, we moved to a 4-track. That was the famous 4-track that basically everybody's using, and Beatles recorded their Sgt. Pepper on. Everybody's using the 4-track. But that opened things up a whole lot from the 3-track, which really wasn't used as much as a 3-track, but as 2 tracks, and then you used one to bounce in a generation away. And by the way, we were playing all our songs isn't like recorded today. They were played like performances. Everybody played together in the room together, you know.
Yeah.
And then the following, and after being at Baxter's, the 3rd album, the following year, '68, that's when the 8-track became available. Soon after that, the 16-track, you know. But still, 2-inch tape. You had to, if you were going to, if God forbid you made a mistake, you know, and it had to be fixed, and that was the take, you know, you were the dirty guy because the razor had to come out and you had to splice that, you know. So nowadays, of course, that's not necessary. But with that ability to have 8 and then 16 tracks, that opened up tracks for experimentation to do different things on and with, you know. So for me, that was great.
It must have been so exciting to be
It
part
was
of.
very exciting, and that was the place you could do it. You couldn't go home and do that, you know. You didn't have access to that equipment, you know.
Am I right in thinking that Volunteers
Not
was?
to mention the team of people that had to be on hand to keep it running.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Volunteers was one of the first albums to be recorded on 16-track, if I've read
Yeah,
that rightly, I think.
exactly.
And that was so I wanted to ask you about the studios, because you worked at RCA a lot, and then you moved to the Wally Hyder studio. And
Well, yeah, we worked down here, and then Wally Hyder, because there was the Grateful Dead were recording all the bands that were up in San Francisco with that San Francisco scene happening. Then, you know, Wally came up with a bright idea. Let's put a studio up there. Okay, and so that was down on Hyde Street, and Wally was great. And so when he put that studio in, we were the first band to go in and do the shakedown, so to speak. And there's a great story to go with that. When it really was up and running, we were happy. We didn't have to fly down to Los Angeles. We didn't have to pay $12 to fly PSA from San Francisco to Los Angeles. I still have a ticket. We were outraged. It went up to $16.50 a couple of years later. And we used to run back and forth in that period of time. Say after Beta Baxter, after that, I think we did some running back and forth where we've taken you know, what we call an earlier flight. Sometimes we'd go down in one day, you know, we'd go down there, go into the studio, jump back on the late flight that would scoot you in just before 2 o'clock to back up to San Francisco, you know.
what's the
In
flight
any case,
time?
when Wally started that new building a studio in San Francisco, that was you know, watershed moment for all of us that lived up there. But so we had the first session booked for Wally's, and I remember there was like the stained glass lamps hanging in there. I mean, it's really set up, you know, like the hippie studio, you know, and all kinds of stuff going on in it, visual stuff. And we set up all of our equipment, and Jack hit the first bass note, and everything, the engineers looked up at the ceiling and shook their head. because all that stuff that was put in there by someone who didn't know about what happens in a recording studio, apparently, it all rattled. The first bass note. We all laughed, packed everything up, you know, went back to our homes. And they tore all this stuff out of the studio, and it came back in a few days later and started to record there.
Oh man.
One note.
So was it literally just ease that it was in, it was closer to home, and
Well, yeah, but I mean, don't forget. I mean, hey, it's 400 miles away.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
I mean, so
see, San Francisco had never been a recording hub. Los Angeles forever. New York, Philadelphia, had been Nashville, of course, for all the country and western acts coming out of there. But San Francisco hadn't been that. So once they opened up a studio there, then it was, and it drew in people from all over the Bay Area. Later on, then Berkeley, had Fantasy Studio, and things moved up because the world was changing, and people were so many artists were living in the San Francisco area. Yeah, it made plenty of sense.
did anything change sonically for you moving studios?
No, I mean you deal with what you have. There's the big room that we recorded in. Yeah, with that, I mean, I think you could put Mantovani's 101 strings in. I mean, it was really interesting because here we had this basically 5-piece band sitting in the middle of the studio, and there was like acres on every side, in this big room, and you could do full blown orchestras in there, no sweat. That's what it was used for. So these were much smaller studios, yeah. But it worked out just fine.
I'm interested to go back to sort of how you started, because you were originally a guitarist, is that right?
Yeah, I started playing guitar at age 12, 1956, in Washington, D.C.
And then you must have, you clearly took to it very quickly and began sort of working, I suppose, playing covers in what would have been, club bands and things like that.
Exactly. I think there's a picture up here that shows me of 14 years old playing with Yorma. He's 17.
Wow.
And I'm in 1958. I'm looking at it right there. We had a little high school band together. I was finishing out junior high school. I was 3 years younger than Yorma. And we were doing Buddy Holly stuff and rockabilly stuff. And Yorma wasn't finger picking at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But we were singing, and we became friends. And played for a year or so in a little band called the Triumph, and you could find this stuff out. In any case, we started Washington D.C. and we did that. We did that for a year, and I was playing guitar. I had a Telecaster that I bought with my newspaper route money. Sold newspapers and had a lawn cutting business, and okay, so.
Oh wow!
So I'm playing. That's Yorma. And speaking of the Wollensack recorder's on the floor. This is the little amplifier my dad and I made with a Heathkit amplifier, 8 watts. And I'm 14 here, 14 and a half. Yorma's 17. I'm playing a brand new Telecaster that I bought for $115.
Wow.
I wish I had that guitar today.
Wow, yeah, 50s Telecaster, yeah, unbelievable.
So anyway, we started. I was playing guitar. I started playing guitar because my father had one up in the attic that was not functioning. It was a Washburn classical guitar, just a couple of strings on it. And I started playing around with it when I was, I don't know, 11 or something. 12, and it disappeared at Christmas 1956, and or before that, and I didn't think anything of it. And of course, you think you do stuff in your household that and your parents don't know what you're doing. But in any case, come Christmas time, I have two brothers, a younger brother and an older brother, and we went down the stairs to the Christmas tree, and I'm looking at everybody got presents, and not too much for Jack. And then there's an envelope on the tree, and it says Jack on it. So I open it up. It says, "Dear Jack, this entitles you to 12 music guitar lessons at the local store up the street, and we had the Washburn strung with steel strings, because he knew I wanted steel strings, I guess, and it was supposed to be ready in time, but it'll be ready next week." So my parents heard me playing and plunking around on it, and luckily very early they were wise enough to just shoot me right into proper instruction right away.
Oh, amazing.
And so I moved on up from, I had that guitar for a little while, and then I bought an ES 175 Gibson, was my first electric guitar, a hollow body F-hole with a single pickup. And then from then, in 1958, I got the Telecaster. And I played around a lot. I started by the time Yorman left the following year to go to college, where he picked up and learned his finger-picking style from Ian Buchanan at Antioch College. And we kept in touch. And I kind of went into the scene in the D.C. area and met other musicians. And Ronnie McDonald was a drummer and singer. And we did a lot of work around the D.C. area, where I'd played in a variety of different kinds of bands, from country and western bands to R&B bands. All of the bands the R&B club circuit bands tended to have two or three horns, a piano. You did a lot of Ray Charles stuff. You did a lot of New Orleans stuff. Huey Piano Smith and the Clowns. You did. It was a different world. It was like the adult world of clubs, And here I was going back into high school every day, and then in the weekends playing these clubs where then you only had to be 18 to work the clubs. And the time that Yorm and I played together, I had fake ID made up, said I was 18, I was 15. But if you look in that picture, I look 15. But in any case, for some reason, I was able to play in all the clubs, and nobody bothered me. There was a big club scene, but that club scene was not oriented around the bands making original music. That was never encouraged. You did Louis Prima, you did Ray Charles stuff, you did, adult. It was almost like little Las Vegases. But there were many different kinds of genres. There was clubs that really worked country and western. First of all, you got to understand Washington, D.C. is in the South, so it's bracketed by Maryland and Virginia, and all that Appalachian music that comes up through Virginia. But at the same time, because it's Washington D.C., it was a rhythm and blues African American scene hub, both for jazz and rhythm and blues, and even folk music, and blues. So the crossroads was just, for me, that wanted to soak up all this different kind of music. It couldn't have been a better environment. But as far as developing it as a musician and developing your own thing and your own style, I had to really go out to California to be let loose with that. But I did run into a couple of players from time to time that said, "Jack, you never played it like the record. You always messed the lines around." And so I guess there you go. But in any case, I played guitar, and the various musicians switched around in various bands, depending on who was available and who wasn't. A good friend of mine, Danny Gatton, who has passed away, he was a wonder kid on guitar. And he's very well known if you look him up. Uh, he at age 12 he could just do things on the instrument that were mind-boggling. But he played banjo and violin and all and everything. But uh, but he was a friend, and he asked me one night. The summertime came and the summertime like jobs where you play Wildwood, New Jersey, and play the Circle Line uh, ferry boat that would go back and forth over the Potomac and over to places like Marshall Hall and places that would have live music in the summertime up and down the shore. Um, and an opportunity came up for I don't know, I think it was a 4-week gig or something, and his bass player. Now let me explain something else. In 1960, say, electric bass guitarists were few and far between. All the bands had stand-up basses. If you listen to all those records, Bobby Blue playing, Ray Charles, and all that, that's all stand-up bass playing. The first guy to really start using an electric bass guitar well was James Brown in the rhythm and blues world. In the country world, a lot of the rockabilly musicians started using the bass guitar. You'll see that the early Fender basses that looked kind of like a Telecaster bass. They were in a lot of bands, and you saw that was playing it. Even though the early recordings were a lot of it was stand-up bass, that was the go-to bass to take out on the road. Mm-hmm. So Fender developed also their basement amp that had the 410s. That basement amplifier, the late 50s amplifier, was really popular with the steel guitar players too, because it had a really great sound. I know you saw that amp in all the country bands. But this gig came up, and he said, Ernie, my bass player, is sick. Do you know of any bass players? And I said, no, I really don't. He says, why don't you do the gig? It's a good gig. I mean, it pays $115 a week, because we're doing 5 sets a night, 6 nights a week, yeah. 40 on, 20 off. That's the gig. 2 shows on Sunday afternoon. And so, but yes, it was great money. Gasoline was 19 cents a gallon.
Wow.
So yeah, you could put $1 in the tank and go somewhere, just like the Chuck Berry song. And so, I said, I don't know anything about the bass, and he says, listen, the bottom, and it's tuned like the bottom 4 strings of the guitar, and he says, how hard can it be? It's only got 4 strings. So that was the joke, So anyway, I did that gig, and I borrowed the other other gentleman's bass guitar, and I fell in love with it. I said, this is really something. I could make an okay guitarist, but I didn't really think of it that way. But looking back on it, I could make an okay guitarist, but I don't think I'm great. But there was something about the sonic world of the bass that I loved. Now, we have to flip a little bit over to my love of orchestras and classical music. Being in Washington, D.C., I mean, that's the mecca of classical music, that in New York. In the 1960s, the early 60s, Jack Casady had put forth this musical exchange initiative with other countries, and so there was a lot of really interesting music coming into the Washington D.C. area and the United States from Russia and Germany, and that where you would see these great classical musicians, the cultural exchange program she started, and with that you'd see the Kirov Ballet and Bolshoi Ballet and folk music from Russia and different lands. The first place I saw the folk music ballet with a Russian balalaika band, unbelievable to see 8 bass balalaikas. You see, I have this balalaika right here. Let's see if I can turn this without disrupting everything. See that?
Oh, yeah, very
in the
cool.
corner? Yeah.
So it looks
So
like we obviously we were talking about oud before we started talking properly, and it looks almost like a bass version of an oud.
so um, so in any case, um, the bass guitar to me was also a cello. I mean, I thought I loved the tone as I worked. I got my first bass guitar later on that summer, 1960. And instead of the precision bass that had been out for a while, like the one you see James Jamerson use and most of the players of that sunburst sculpted back precision, Fender had just come out that summer with a jazz bass. And I went down to the, the music store. I'll think of it in a second. But in any case, I went down and uh, I ordered one. I remember it's really expensive. I think it was $228 or something like that, which was a lot of money for an instrument back then.
So
And
it's double the Telecaster you bought.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it was a new instrument. And it was interesting because I had two, called the jazz bass. I had two pickups and concentric pots where you could volume, tone. So you could really mix the combination of tones. I like that manipulation of the tones a lot more. And then it was a little easier. I don't have huge hands, so the nut was a little more narrow, and the playing was easier for my hands. So once I got my hands on one, I ordered one, and that pretty much it launched me that year into playing the bass. And I must admit, my work quota expanded exponentially with playing the bass. So for those next few years, I played both in guitar in some bands and bass in others. And I would meet up with Yorma from time to time. A couple of years later, he was on a work furlough program, and I'd take the train up to New York from D.C., and we go to all the folk clubs and hear Reverend Gary Davis and Sonny Terry and Brown McGee and Gertie's Folk City and all of that scene that was happening in the New York and Washington and the early folk scene where Dave Van Ronk and the Holy Modal Rounders and all of these basically urban white musicians were listening to old 30s and 40s music and jug bands forming, like Jerry Garcia was in, and listening to that kind of music. And then out of that grew the originals like a Bob Dylan that would start to write his own material after being so influenced by Woody Guthrie and that folk music revival of the early 1960s. But at the same time, and I really enjoy that, my older brother, Charles Casady, which is how I met Yorma because they were only a year apart in high school. We'd have these great listening sessions, and we collected records. And I was fortunate enough to be able to just jump on a bus at 12 and 13 years old, go down to the Library of Congress into the music collection and listen to these recordings from all over the world. Today you call that world music, but pygmies of the rainforest, and the sounds of these were actual records. You go in, you take these records out and go into a booth for 78 records and listen to music from all over the world. Music from Pakistan and music, just from Africa, and you'd soak all this in. Later on was the beginning of a lot of that music being collected. For instance, the Harry Smith collection and a bunch of others that would put those collections together onto something new called the long playing album. And so anyway, all that was happening. All this is happening all within about a 5-year bracket. And I'd meet Yorma up in New York, and we'd listen to all the folk plays. And Yorma had just started learning the Piedmont style with the thumb and two fingers, finger picks, and influenced by Reverend Gary Davis and a number of other players, while starting to develop his own sound on the instrument. So a couple of years later, I'm still working in that club scene in Washington, D.C., and listening to a lot of jazz in that early period. I guess what I was going to say also was all that new jazz was starting to come in early 60s, where you had those players like I say John Coltrane and Yusef Lateef and uh, uh, Charles Mingus and Eric Dolphy. Eric Dolphy is a big influence on me, and the way he got tone out of his that bass clarinet. I always carried that with me. I love it to this day. In any case, all this music is sort of pouring through. I didn't want to play jazz. I didn't know, but it was influenced a lot by it. And when I was talking to Yorma, who had transferred out from Antioch to the West Coast in '62, and he was teaching music. We were talking together one night through a mutual friend, a banjo player, and I said, "What are you doing out there?" He said, "Well, I've joined a band, a folk rock band." I said, "What, you the purist?" And he says, "Yeah, it's really cool." He said, "But we need a bass player." And because I just told him, "Yeah." He said, "What are you doing there?" I said, "Yeah, doing the usual. I'm staying in school, keeping out of the Army. Because don't forget, if you were 18, you were drafted to Vietnam then. It's 1965. So 64, I guess, 65 when I was talking to him. Yeah, 65. And this draft had started to heat up. So you had to maintain, you go back, I took a year off from after high school and played around all over. Went down to Florida and played in a bunch of clubs and all around. And then went back into college. But in any case, I said, "Yeah, I'm playing guitar and bass." And he says, "You're playing a bass guitar?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, let me call you back." So he calls me back, says, "Listen, why don't you come out to San Francisco? There's a great music scene going on out here, and try out for this band, And so he brought me. He had me. Plane ticket. Went out. Took my first plane flight. Went out to San Francisco. A couple of weeks before I went there, I was playing in a club for 2 weeks solid, I think, and we left the instruments in the club at night, and it got stolen. The club was broken into. My Fender 60s jazz bass, first year that it came out, was stolen. I wish I had that bass today. In any case, I arrived out there with no bass and borrowed the other guy's bass player, Bob Harvey, I think. And in any case, we did our first gig. We rehearsed for a while, and we did a first gig at Harmon Gymnasium, I think October 16th, something like that. And they said, "You're on." The only thing is I had a mustache, and Paul wouldn't me shave the mustache. So I said, I don't know. I looked like some geek out of, I wasn't cool looking. So I told him, "Okay, I'll meet you halfway." And I came in the next rehearsal with half the mustache shaved.
Amazing.
I wasn't about to be told what to do, But anyway, it all worked out.
There we go, the first part of my conversation with Jack Casady, and I hope you enjoyed listening to that. So that just leaves me to say that if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by buying a mug. They are very cool enamel mugs that will not break if you drop them, because they're made of metal, I think is enameled metal. Anyway, go to the website, allyouneedisdrums.com, and click on shop, and you'll be able to purchase one there. Thank you to everybody who's bought one already, and thank you for listening. And that just leaves me also get to say a huge thank you to my friend Joe Kane for the intro and outro music, and my good friend David Henshaw for the artwork he supplies every week now. And I will see you in 1 week's time. Have a lovely 7 days. Goodbye.